Before the walls collapsed, before the trumpets sounded, before the dust swallowed the city, Jericho believed it was untouchable. The sentries walked the ramparts as their fathers had done, their fathers' fathers before them. Generation after generation, those walls had stood, 40 feet of stone and earth, 15 feet thick at the base, rising from the Jordan Valley like the spine of a mountain. No army in living memory had breached them. No siege had starved them. No king had conquered them. And now, in the dying light of another day, the guards looked east toward the river and saw what they had been seeing for 7 days. Silence. The strangest army they had ever witnessed. Not attacking, not building siege towers, not digging beneath the foundations, just walking, circling, once around the entire city, then returning to their camp. The same ritual, day after day, and the sound. That terrible, mournful sound. 7 priests with ram's horn trumpets, the slow, grinding march of thousands of feet, and then nothing, returning to their tents as if this were some kind of religious procession rather than a military campaign. The guards did not understand. Their commanders did not understand. King and council whispered in the palace, searching the archives for any record of such tactics. But Jericho's walls had never faced an enemy like this, because this enemy did not trust in battering rams or siegecraft or the strength of human arms. This enemy trusted in something the people of Jericho had long forgotten, the voice of the God who splits seas. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened at Jericho, to comprehend the moment when physics bent to faith and stone surrendered to sound, we must go back. Back before the march, before the crossing, back to the wilderness where a generation learned what it meant to follow a God who does not operate by the logic of empires. Back to the man who would stand before those walls and speak a command that would echo through 3,000 years of human history. The wilderness of Sinai stretched endlessly in all directions. 40 years, an entire generation had been born, had grown, had learned to survive in a landscape that offered nothing but lessons in dependence. The children of Israel had left Egypt as slaves, with the taste of bondage still bitter in their mouths. They had watched the Red Sea part. They had eaten bread that fell from heaven. They had drunk water from rocks. They had received the law at the mountain, wrapped in smoke and thunder, and they had failed. When the spies returned from Canaan with reports of fortified cities and giants in the land, the people had chosen fear over faith. They had stood at the border of promise and turned back into the wasteland. God had sworn that generation would not enter, would not see the land flowing with milk and honey, would die in the dust and heat of the desert that had become both punishment and preparation. Now their children stood at a different border. The Jordan River marked the boundary between wandering and inheritance, between promise spoken and promise fulfilled. And the man who would lead them across was not the man who had led them out of Egypt. Moses was gone, the great prophet, the lawgiver, the man who had confronted Pharaoh and climbed the mountain to speak with God face to face. He had died on Mount Nebo, looking across the valley at the land he would never enter. His burial place remained unknown. His era had ended, and in his place stood a man who had been faithful when others faltered, a man who had believed the spies' report 40 years ago when 10 said impossible, and only 2 said God is able. Joshua, son of Nun. He was not young anymore. The wilderness years had carved lines into his face, had turned his beard gray, had taught him patience in a school where impatience meant death. He had been Moses' assistant, his military commander, the man who held up the prophet's arms during battle, the man who stayed in the tent of meeting when others left. the man who, along with Caleb, had stood against an entire nation and declared that the giants were bread for Israel to devour. Now God spoke to him with words that carried both promise and weight. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given to you. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous. 3 times in that commission God repeated the command, be strong and courageous, as if he knew what Joshua would face, as if he knew that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward when every rational calculation says stop. Joshua stood on the eastern bank of the Jordan and looked across at the land that had haunted his dreams for 40 years, the land he had walked through as a spy, the land of fortified cities and trained armies and kings who ruled from thrones centuries old, the land God had sworn to Abraham 600 years before, the land that belonged to Israel not by conquest but by covenant, by promise, by divine decree that preceded any human claim. But divine decree still required human feet to march, human hands to grip weapons, human hearts to trust when the odds looked impossible. The Jordan was in flood. Spring melt from the mountains, the river swollen beyond its banks, a churning barrier of brown water that should have stopped an army for weeks while they built boats or waited for the level to drop. Joshua did not wait. He gave the command to the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest containing the tablets of the law, the visible symbol of God's presence among his people. Walk into the river. It was madness, the kind of madness that looks like faith when God is in it and looks like suicide when he is not. The priests lifted the ark, moved toward the flooded banks, and the moment their feet touched the water, the Jordan stopped flowing. Upstream at a town called Adam, the waters piled up in a heap. Downstream, the river drained away toward the Dead Sea. And in between, the riverbed lay exposed. Dry ground, not mud, not marsh. Dry ground hard enough for an entire nation to cross. 2 million people with their livestock and possessions and children, walking across on the floor of a river held back by invisible hands. The priests stood in the middle holding the ark, and all of Israel passed by. When the last person reached the western bank, when the 12 memorial stones had been taken from the river and set up at Gilgal, when the priests carrying the ark finally stepped up onto dry land, the Jordan returned. The waters crashed back into their channel with the sound of something released from captivity, and any Canaanite scout watching from the hills would have reported back to his king that the God of Israel had just announced his arrival. The same God who drowned Egypt's army now held back the Jordan, and he was bringing his people home. But home was occupied. The land of Canaan was not empty wilderness waiting for settlers. It was a patchwork of city-states and kingdoms, fortified strongholds built on tells, the ancient mounds formed by centuries of habitation. Each city had its king, its army, its gods. The Canaanites worshipped Baal and Asherah. They practiced divination and sacred prostitution. They sacrificed their children in fire to Molech. They had occupied this land for generations, and they had no intention of surrendering it to a nation of former slaves led by an invisible God. Jericho was the gateway. It stood 6 miles west of the Jordan, rising from the valley floor like a clenched fist. The oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Archaeological layers going back 8,000 years. Built and rebuilt. Destroyed and reconstructed. Its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, had outlasted empires, had turned back armies that Israel's ancestors could not have imagined. The city occupied a strategic position. Whoever controlled Jericho controlled the Jordan Valley, controlled the roads into the hill country, controlled access to the heartland of Canaan. It was not the largest city, not the most powerful kingdom, but it was the door. And the door was locked with stone and timber and bronze gates that had not opened for an invading army in living memory. The walls were the city's pride, double fortification, an outer wall and an inner wall with houses built in the space between. The outer wall stood on the slope of the ancient mound. The inner wall crowned the summit. Together they created a defense system that should have been impregnable. Archers on the ramparts could rain arrows on anyone approaching. Defenders could pour boiling oil through murder holes. The gates were reinforced with bronze. The watchtowers gave visibility for miles. And the people of Jericho believed those walls made them gods. This was the fatal error. Not the walls themselves, but the trust placed in them. The conviction that stone and human engineering could stand against the purposes of heaven. They had heard what happened in Egypt. The reports had reached them, 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn, the drowning of Pharaoh's army. They had heard about the Red Sea, about the manna in the wilderness, about the defeats of Sihon and Og, the Amorite kings on the eastern side of the Jordan. And still they trusted their walls. Still they believed that what had destroyed Egypt and drowned armies could be stopped by 40 feet of brick and stone. This was not confidence. It was delusion, the kind of delusion that comes when military strength becomes an idol, when the thing meant to protect becomes the thing that blinds. King of Jericho sat in his palace and reviewed his defenses. Granaries full, water cisterns filled, armory stocked with weapons, garrison of trained soldiers, escape routes planned if the siege lasted too long. By every calculation of military strategy, Jericho could outlast any siege Israel could mount. The Hebrews had no siege engines, no history of urban warfare. They were desert wanderers led by an old man who had spent 40 years walking in circles. What could they possibly do against walls like these? The king did not know he was asking the wrong question. The question was not what Israel could do. The question was what their God would do. And the answer to that question could not be found in military manuals or strategic planning or the dimensions of fortifications. Joshua stood at Gilgal, the Israelite camp established west of the Jordan. The men had just been circumcised, reviving the covenant sign that had lapsed during the wilderness wandering. They had celebrated Passover for the first time in the Promised Land. The manna had stopped. From now on, they would eat the produce of Canaan, the food of the land they were taking possession of. Everything was shifting, the old patterns ending, the new reality beginning. And Joshua knew that Jericho was not just a military obstacle, it was a test, a declaration, a statement about how this conquest would proceed. If Israel took Jericho by a conventional siege, the Canaanites would interpret it as one more tribal conflict, one more shift in the endless power struggles of the ancient Near East. But if God took Jericho, if he demonstrated that no fortress could stand before him, then every king from Dan to Beersheba would know that this was not a human invasion. This was divine judgment. The Canaanites had filled up their measure of iniquity. 400 years earlier, God had told Abraham that his descendants would return to possess this land. But not yet. The sin of the Amorites had not yet reached its full measure. Now it had. The abominations had multiplied. The child sacrifices, the sacred prostitution, the occult practices, the worship of demons masquerading as gods. Canaan had become a spiritual cancer, and God was cutting it out. Israel was the instrument, the sword of divine judgment. not because they were righteous in themselves, but because God had chosen them for His purposes and bound Himself to them by covenant. Moses had warned them, "If you become like the Canaanites, if you practice their abominations, the land will vomit you out just as it is vomiting them out." The conquest was not ethnic superiority. It was covenantal responsibility carried out under divine command. And it would begin at Jericho. Joshua walked the perimeter alone, studying the walls, calculating, not siege tactics, but obedience. How do you obey a God who specializes in the impossible? How do you lead an army into battle when the battle plan makes no military sense? These were not new questions for Joshua. He had watched Moses deal with them for 40 years, had seen what happened when Israel trusted God and what happened when they relied on their own understanding. Trust had parted seas. Unbelief had resulted in 40 years of wilderness wandering. As Joshua studied those walls, a figure appeared before him, a man with a drawn sword. Joshua did not hesitate. He approached and asked the question that mattered. "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The answer came with authority that made the ground feel holy. "Neither. I am commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." Joshua fell on his face. "Take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground." This was not a vision, not a dream. This was a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, the divine warrior who leads heaven's armies. And his presence meant that the battle for Jericho was already won, not by Israel's strategy, not by Joshua's leadership, by the purposes of God working themselves out in history through people willing to obey commands that made no sense. The instructions came not through Joshua's military intuition, through direct revelation. March around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests with 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day, march around 7 times, then blow the trumpets. Then have all the people shout, and the walls will fall down flat. No battering rams, no siege towers, no undermining the foundations, just walking, trumpets, shouting, and faith that God would do what He promised. This was the plan that would break Jericho. Joshua gathered the commanders, the priests, the people. He gave them the instructions. To their credit, no one laughed. No one objected. No one suggested a more conventional approach. 40 years in the wilderness had taught them something, had burned into their collective memory the lesson their parents had failed to learn. When God gives a command, you obey, even when it looks foolish, even when it contradicts everything you know about warfare, even when the walls look impossibly high and the city impossibly strong. You obey because the one giving the command is the same one who split the Red Sea and held back the Jordan and fed you manna for 40 years and never once failed to keep a promise. The first day dawned with desert heat already rising from the valley floor. The priests lifted the ark. The armed guard formed up ahead of them. 7 priests with 7 ram's horn trumpets took their positions. And behind the ark came the rest of Israel. The entire nation mobilized not for conventional warfare, but for a demonstration of faith that would echo through millennia. The trumpets sounded, not a battle cry, a sustained, mournful blast. The sound of rams' horns, the same instruments that had announced the year of Jubilee. The sound of release, of walls coming down, of captives going free. The sound that would, centuries later, announce the presence of God on mountains and the coming of kings. They marched, in silence except for the trumpets and the rhythm of feet. Thousands of feet, moving around a city that watched from the ramparts with confusion, turning slowly to contempt. This was Israel's great assault, walking. The guards called down mockery, pointed, laughed, made gestures of derision, but some did not laugh. Some remembered the reports from Egypt, remembered that this god specialized in making the powerful look foolish, remembered that walls and weapons and military might had not saved Pharaoh, had not saved Sihon and Og, and those who remembered felt the first cold touch of fear. What if the walking was not weakness? What if it was the calm before divine judgment? What if those trumpets were not instruments of music, but announcements of execution? The circuit completed, Israel returned to camp at Gilgal. No attack, no siege, just the daily march. And inside Jericho, the tension began to build, because there is something more terrifying than an army that attacks. And that is an army that waits with confidence, as if they know something you do not. As if the outcome is already decided, and they are simply following the script of a drama whose ending has already been written by hands you cannot see. Day 2, the same ritual, the same trumpet blasts, the same silent march around walls that seemed to mock the very idea that they could fall. Day 3, Day 4, the routine becoming familiar, the guards on the walls growing used to it, almost bored, almost, but not quite, because each day the question grew larger in the minds of Jericho's people. What are they doing? The spies moved through Jericho like ghosts in daylight, their eyes scanning every street corner, every guard post, every weakness in the massive fortifications that ring the city. They walked among merchants who had no idea that their doom had already been decided, past soldiers who would soon face an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. The architecture of Jericho spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. The city had stood at this crossroads for longer than most civilizations had existed. Its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had weathered sieges and storms, had turned back every army that dared approach with hostile intent. The stones themselves seemed to mock the very idea that two Hebrew wanderers could pose any threat to this ancient fortress. But the spies were not looking at what was. They were seeing what would be. They noted the positions of the granaries, the locations of the armories, the patterns of the guard rotations. They observed the merchant caravans coming and going through the massive gates, the way the bronze hinges groaned under the weight, the mechanisms that sealed the city each night. They memorized the layout of the streets, the placement of the temples, the districts where the wealthy lived, and where the soldiers quartered. And everywhere they looked, they saw fear. It was subtle at first. A merchant who spoke too quickly about trade routes that had mysteriously gone silent. A soldier whose hand lingered too long on his weapon when discussing the Hebrew camp visible in the distance. Women who hurried their children inside when the western horizon was mentioned. The fear was like a disease that had infected the city, invisible but pervasive, unspoken but unmistakable. The king of Jericho had heard the reports. Everyone had heard the reports. An entire nation had crossed the Jordan River on dry ground. The waters had simply stopped flowing, piling up in a heap miles upstream, while 40,000 armed men marched across the riverbed with the sacred ark of their God carried in the midst of them. Farmers working fields had witnessed it. Travelers on the trade routes had seen it. The impossible had happened in broad daylight, with witnesses beyond counting, and that was only the most recent impossibility. The stories had been filtering into Jericho for months, for years. Stories of a people who had destroyed the greatest empire on earth without lifting a sword, who had walked out of Egyptian slavery through a divided sea, who had survived in a wilderness that should have consumed them, who carried with them the presence of a God who did not dwell in temples of stone, but in a tent that moved with them wherever they went. The king of Jericho knew something else as well. He knew what had happened to the Amorite kings east of the Jordan. Sihon and Og, mighty rulers with armies that had dominated the region for generations, had made the mistake of marching against these Hebrews. Their kingdoms had been erased from the earth, their cities burned, their armies annihilated. The land that had been theirs now belonged to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh. No negotiations, no terms, total destruction. The word had spread through every city west of the Jordan. The Hebrews took no prisoners. They made no treaties. They served a God who had given them this land by covenant, and they would have it, no matter how many armies stood in their way. But Jericho was not like those other cities. Jericho was the guardian of Canaan, the fortress that controlled access to the entire region. Its walls had never been breached. Its gates had never been forced. Let the Hebrews come with their desert god and their wilderness warfare. Let them try to take the city that had stood unconquered since the dawn of civilization. The spies heard all of this in the marketplaces and taverns, in the whispered conversations of merchants and the boasting of soldiers. They heard the fear and they heard the defiance, and they understood that Jericho would not surrender, could not surrender. To open the gates to the Hebrews would be to admit that the old gods had failed, that the old order was finished, that a new age had begun. And so the city had sealed itself in. The gates that normally stood open during daylight hours, welcoming traders and travelers, now opened only briefly and with heavy guard presence. Soldiers scrutinized everyone who entered. The watch on the walls had been doubled, then tripled. Weapons that had been stored in armories for years were distributed. Food supplies were inventoried and rationed. Wells were tested to ensure the water would last through a prolonged siege. Jericho was preparing for war. The spies took note of all of this, their minds cataloging every detail that might prove useful when the assault came, but they also understood something that the king and his advisors did not. This would not be a normal siege. The God who had dried up the Jordan River did not need siege towers and battering rams. The God who had devastated Egypt with plagues did not require months of waiting for starvation to force a surrender. Something else was coming, something the walls of Jericho could not stop. As the sun climbed toward midday, the spies found themselves near the eastern wall in a district where the houses were built directly into the fortifications themselves. This was common in ancient cities, a way to maximize space and provide additional structural support to the walls. The poor and the merchants often lived in these integrated dwellings, their windows looking out over the approach to the city. It was in one of these houses that their presence was finally detected. A woman stood in a doorway, her eyes meeting theirs with a directness that was startling. She was perhaps 30 years old, her face marked by experience and intelligence. Her clothing was fine but practical, the garments of someone who dealt with people of wealth but was not wealthy herself. Something in her expression told the spies that she knew exactly who they were and what they were doing in Jericho. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the three of them stood frozen in the street, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. Then the woman stepped back into her house and gestured for them to follow. The spies exchanged a glance. This could be a trap. She could be working with the city guard, leading them into an ambush. But something in her eyes spoke of desperation, rather than deception, of fear mixed with a wild, impossible hope. They followed her inside. The house was larger than it appeared from the street, with rooms that extended back into the wall itself. Bundles of flax lay drying on the roof, accessible by an interior ladder. The furnishings were modest but well kept. A window on the outer wall looked down at the approach to the city, a view that would have been valuable to many different types of people. The woman closed the door and turned to face them. Her name was Rahab, and she knew why they had come. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush of confession and plea. She told them that the entire city was paralyzed with fear, that the hearts of the people had melted like wax when they heard what the God of the Hebrews had done at the Red Sea, how he had dried up the water before them when they came out of Egypt. She told them about the defeat of Sihon and Og, how the news had spread terror through every household in Jericho. And then she said the words that would echo through the millennia. The Lord your God is God in heaven, above and on earth below. A Canaanite woman, living in a city devoted to the worship of Baal and Asherah, and a pantheon of lesser deities, declaring allegiance to the God of Israel. A woman who made her living by means that would have marked her as an outcast in Hebrew society, confessing faith in the one true God. The spies listened as she explained her situation. She had heard the stories. She had seen the fear in the eyes of the soldiers and the king's advisors. She had watched the city seal itself in, preparing for a siege that everyone knew, deep in their hearts, would end only one way. The walls might be thick and the gates might be strong, but no defense could stand against a God who commanded the waters of the earth and brought empires to their knees. She asked only one thing. When the judgment came, when the walls fell and the city was given over to destruction, she wanted protection for herself and her family. Her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, everyone who belonged to her household. She would hide the spies, would help them escape, would keep their mission secret from the king's men. In return, she wanted a covenant, an oath sworn in the name of the God who had dried up the Jordan. The spies understood the risk she was taking. In any city under siege, harboring enemy agents was an act of treason, punishable by immediate death. If she was discovered, she would not be given a trial or a hearing. She would be executed on the spot, along with everyone in her house. She was gambling everything on the hope that the God of Israel was merciful, as well as mighty. Before they could answer, voices echoed in the street outside. The king's men were searching the district. Someone had noticed the strangers, had reported them to the authorities, had described two men who did not belong in Jericho and who moved through the streets with the purposeful observation of military scouts. The city guard had been dispatched, and they were going door to door, searching every house, questioning every resident. Rahab moved with the speed of someone who had already planned for this possibility. She led the spies up the ladder to the roof and hid them under the stalks of flax that lay drying in the sun. The long fibers covered them completely, transforming them into invisible lumps among the harvest materials. Then she climbed back down and closed the roof access behind her. The pounding on her door came moments later. The guards demanded to know if she had seen the strangers. They described the men in detail, noted which direction they had been heading, insisted that they must have come this way. Rahab met their questions with the practiced ease of someone who had dealt with difficult men before. Yes, she told them, the men had come to her house, but they had left at dusk, just before the gates were to be shut. If the guards hurried, they might still catch them on the road to the fords of the Jordan. The deception was flawless. The urgency in her voice, the helpful details, the logical assumption that spies would want to return to their camp as quickly as possible. The guards believed her because the lie fit their expectations, because she gave them a clear course of action, because she was exactly the sort of person who would have noticed strange men in the neighborhood. They rushed off toward the gates, calling for horses and additional men to pursue the fleeing spies before they could reach the river. On the roof, under the drying flax, the two Hebrews lay motionless and listened to the sounds of the search moving away through the city. They heard the gates open, heard the thunder of hooves, as mounted soldiers rode out in pursuit of ghosts. They heard the gates slam shut again, sealing Jericho in for the night. Then silence settled over the city, broken only by the calls of the watch on the walls and the distant sounds of evening routines in the houses below. Rahab climbed back to the roof after full darkness had fallen. The spies emerged from their hiding place, brushing flax fibers from their clothes, their hearts still racing from the nearness of discovery. They looked at this Canaanite woman who had just committed treason against her own people to save their lives, and they understood that something profound had just occurred. She spoke to them in the darkness, her voice low but urgent. She told them what she needed them to know, what they would report back to Joshua and the elders. The people of Jericho were terrified. The soldiers put on brave faces, but in private they spoke of nothing but the miracles of the Hebrew God. Families had begun hoarding food and water. Some had tried to flee the city in the weeks before the gates were sealed, abandoning homes and businesses to seek safety in the hill country or the distant coastal cities. No one believed Jericho could stand. They believed only that the walls would delay the inevitable. She asked again for the covenant, the promise that when destruction came, her household would be spared. The spies swore an oath in the name of the Lord, binding themselves and their people to protect her and everyone she gathered into her house. But they gave her specific instructions. She was to bind a scarlet cord in the window that overlooked the approach to the city. When the Hebrews came, when the assault began, she was to bring her entire family inside this house and keep them there. Anyone who went out into the street would be beyond the reach of the covenant. Anyone who remained inside would be saved. The crimson cord would mark her house as clearly as the blood on the doorposts had marked the Hebrew homes in Egypt on the night of the Passover. Death would pass over this dwelling while it consumed everything around it. Rahab accepted the terms. She would keep the covenant if they would keep theirs. Then she led them to the window and showed them the way of escape. Her house was built directly into the wall, and her window opened to the outside. It was a long drop to the ground below, but she had a rope strong enough to lower them down. She told them to flee to the hill country west of the city, to hide there for 3 days until the search parties had given up and returned to Jericho. After that, they could circle back to the Jordan and rejoin their people. The spies listened to her instructions with the understanding that this woman's knowledge of covert movement and escape routes came from years of living on the edge of respectability and law. She knew how to avoid attention, how to disappear, how to survive in a world that would condemn her in public while using her services in private. Her skills, developed for entirely different purposes, were now being used to preserve the lives of men who served a God who hated everything her profession represented. It was a strange mercy, a mysterious providence that would become a recurring theme in the conquest of Canaan. God using the unlikely, the outcast, the unexpected to accomplish his purposes. A prostitute in Jericho becoming an agent of divine judgment. A woman of Canaan becoming an ancestor of the Messiah himself, though she did not know it yet. The spies climbed out the window and descended the scarlet rope, dropping the last few feet to land in the shadows at the base of the wall. Above them, Rahab watched from the window, the rope still in her hands. They looked up at her one final time. This woman who had chosen the God of Israel over the gods of her fathers, who had risked everything on the belief that the God who dried up seas and rivers would also show kindness to a Canaanite sinner. Then they disappeared into the darkness, moving quickly away from the city toward the broken terrain of the hill country. Behind them, Jericho settled into an uneasy sleep, its gates barred, its walls manned, its people locked inside with their fear and their failing gods. The spies spent 3 days in the wilderness, hiding among rocks and caves, while search parties combed the area around the fords of the Jordan. They could hear the soldiers calling to each other, could see their torches in the darkness, could track their movements through the scrub brush and wadis. But the king's men were searching for 2 spies, fleeing east toward the river. They never thought to look in the hills to the west, never imagined that the Hebrews would move deeper into Canaanite territory rather than racing back to the safety of their camp. When the search finally ended and the soldiers returned to Jericho empty-handed, the spies began their careful journey back to Shittim. They moved at night, rested during the day in hidden places, avoided all contact with the scattered settlements and farming villages that dotted the landscape. The journey that had taken them hours in the company of merchants and travelers now took them the better part of a week as they worked their way back to the Jordan. When they finally crossed the river and entered the Hebrew camp, they went immediately to Joshua. The general received them in his tent, with the elders and commanders gathered to hear their report. The spies spoke of everything they had seen and heard in Jericho. They described the fortifications in detail, the thickness of the walls, the strength of the gates, the size of the garrison. But more importantly, they described the fear that gripped the city like a plague. The people of Jericho knew they could not win. They knew that the God who had delivered Israel from Egypt and brought them through the wilderness could not be stopped by walls of stone and gates of bronze. The hearts of the inhabitants had melted. The soldiers were demoralized. The city was a fortress, yes, but it was a fortress manned by men who had already lost hope. Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, the spies declared. All the inhabitants of the land melt in fear because of us. Joshua listened to their report with the same intensity he had brought to every military council since taking command of Israel. He understood siege warfare. He had studied the tactics employed by the great armies of the age. He knew that a city like Jericho could hold out for months, perhaps years if its supplies were well managed and its walls held firm. A direct assault would be suicidal. The attackers would be exposed to fire from above while trying to scale walls 30 feet high and 20 feet thick. Battering rams would make little progress against gates designed to withstand such weapons. Siege towers would be met with burning oil and stones hurled from the ramparts. By every conventional measure of military strategy, taking Jericho would require either a prolonged siege or unacceptable casualties. But Joshua was not planning a conventional assault. He had received his orders from a commander whose strategies were not limited by the laws of siege warfare or the constraints of human engineering. The God who had brought Israel to this moment had already determined how Jericho would fall. The plan was not what any military mind would have devised. It violated every principle of tactical surprise and overwhelming force. It seemed, by every rational measure, absurd. But Joshua had learned long ago that the wisdom of God often looked like foolishness to human understanding. He had watched Moses raise a staff and see the sea divide. He had seen water flow from rocks and bread fall from heaven. He had witnessed the pillar of cloud and fire that guided them through the wilderness. The God who did these things did not need battering rams and siege towers to bring down walls. He needed only obedience. Joshua called for the commanders of the armed men, the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant, and the heads of the tribes. He gave them their instructions, and as he spoke, more than one hardened warrior felt a chill run down his spine. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was something entirely different, something that blurred the line between military campaign and religious ritual, between human action and divine intervention. They would march around the city once each day for 6 days. The armed men would go first, followed by 7 priests carrying rams' horn trumpets, followed by the Ark of the Covenant, carried by the Levites, followed by the rear guard. They would make the circuit in complete silence except for the sound of the trumpets. No war cries, no shouted challenges, no taunts hurled at the defenders on the walls. Just the tramp of thousands of feet, the blast of the ram's horns, and the presence of the ark moving around the perimeter of the city. On the 7th day, they would march around the city 7 times. And on the 7th circuit, when the trumpet sounded a long blast, the entire assembly would shout with a great shout, and the walls would fall. The commanders received these orders with a mixture of faith and bewilderment. Some of them had fought in the battles against Sihon and Og. They had seen the Hebrews fight with swords and spears, had watched disciplined ranks of infantry break enemy formations, had participated in conventional military victories. This was different. This required them to trust that simply walking around a city while priests blew trumpets would accomplish what siege engines and assault tactics could not. But they had also seen the Jordan dry up at the approach of the ark. They had walked across the riverbed on dry ground, while the waters stood in a heap upstream. They knew that the God they served did not operate by the rules that governed other armies and other gods. If he said the walls would fall, the walls would fall. The preparations began immediately. The march would commence the next morning at first light. Every fighting man in the camp was to participate, arranged by tribes and divisions in perfect order. The priests were instructed in exactly how they were to carry the ark, how they were to blow the trumpets, when they were to begin, and when they were to stop. The people were warned to maintain absolute silence during the march. Anyone who spoke, who shouted, who made any sound except the commanded shout on the 7th day would be guilty of disobedience that could cost Israel the victory. This was not a test of strength or strategy. This was a test of faith and obedience. Word spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire. By evening, every person in the Hebrew multitude knew what was planned for the morning. Some received the news with joy, convinced that they were about to witness another mighty act of God. Others felt doubt gnawing at their minds, wondering if this strange plan would work, or if they would become a laughingstock before their enemies. The older generation, those who had lived through the wilderness years, remembered other moments when God had commanded strange things. They remembered being told to look at a bronze serpent to be healed from deadly snake bites. They remembered the manna that had to be gathered each morning and could not be stored overnight, except on the day before the Sabbath, when it would keep fresh. They remembered water flowing from rocks and battles won by the position of Moses' staff, rather than the skill of the warriors. The God of Israel did not act like other gods. His methods confounded human wisdom. His strategies made no sense until the moment they succeeded spectacularly. In Jericho, the defenders on the walls watched the Hebrew camp with growing tension. The spies had not been found. The search parties had returned empty-handed, forced to admit that either the infiltrators had escaped or had never existed in the first place. But the king's advisors knew better. Someone had been in the city. Someone had observed their defenses. Somewhere in that vast encampment across the river, Hebrew commanders were studying reports and planning their assault. The question was when it would come and what form it would take. The garrison was at full readiness. Weapons had been distributed. Supplies had been positioned along the walls. Water carriers stood ready to douse any fire arrows. Stones and spears were piled at intervals along the ramparts. Archers had been assigned their positions. The gates were reinforced with additional bracing. Every defensive measure that military experience could suggest had been implemented. Jericho was as ready as it would ever be. But in one house built into the eastern wall, a woman named Rahab tied a scarlet cord in her window and began the careful work of gathering her family. She sent word to her father and mother, to her brothers and sisters, telling them to come to her house and to bring nothing with them. Some came willingly, trusting her judgment, even if they did not understand her urgency. Others came reluctantly, wondering why she insisted they abandon their homes to crowd into her modest dwelling. She did not tell them about the spies. She did not explain the covenant or the promise of protection. She simply insisted that when the Hebrew assault came, they must all be together in her house. Anyone who left, anyone who went out into the street for any reason, would not be her responsibility. They thought she was being superstitious, perhaps even cowardly. But they came, because family ties ran deep, and because the fear in the city was making everyone irrational anyway. If Rahab wanted them gathered in her house when the siege began, what harm could it do? The scarlet cord hung in the window, visible to anyone who looked up from the approach to the city. To the guards on the walls, it was meaningless, perhaps a signal to someone outside, or simply a piece of colored rope with no significance. They did not know that it marked the only house in Jericho that would still be standing when the sun set 7 days hence. Night fell over the Jordan Valley. In the Hebrew camp, 40,000 warriors prepared their weapons and their hearts for a campaign unlike any in history. In Jericho, soldiers stood watch on walls that had never been breached, protecting a city that had never fallen, serving gods that would soon prove powerless to save them. And between the two camps, the presence of the Lord hovered like a storm about to break, waiting only for the moment when human obedience would release divine power and the impossible would once again become reality before the eyes of a watching world. But first would come the march, the silence, the trumpets, and the test of whether Israel would trust their God enough to follow instructions that made no military sense whatsoever. The heat on the seventh day was different. The sun rose blood-red over the Jordan Valley, and the air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. Inside Jericho, the soldiers on the walls had barely slept. Something in their bones told them this day would be unlike the others. Something ancient and terrible was approaching. The Israelite camp stirred before dawn. Joshua moved among the tribes with quiet authority, giving final instructions that had been whispered to him in the darkness by the voice he had come to recognize as the commander of heaven's armies. The priests who carried the ark had fasted through the night. Their hands trembled not from weakness, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. 7 priests stood ready, each holding a ram's horn trumpet. These were not ordinary instruments of war. They were shopharim, carved from the horns of rams sacrificed during Passover, instruments that had announced the presence of God on Mount Sinai, that had called Israel to assembly in the wilderness. In their curved forms resided the memory of covenant, of promise, of a God who spoke through thunder and manifested in fire. The armed guard assembled in formation, 40,000 warriors, their weapons cleaned and sharpened, though they had not raised them in 6 days. Behind them, the whole congregation of Israel gathered, men and women and children, every soul that had crossed the Jordan on dry ground. They were witnesses to something that defied every law of siege warfare, every principle of military strategy known to the ancient world. The ark was lifted onto the shoulders of the priests. Gold reflected the rising sun. Between the cherubim, in that space where heaven met earth, power gathered like a gathering storm. The priests who bore it felt the weight increase, not physically but spiritually, as if the very presence of God was pressing down upon the mercy seat with greater intensity than ever before. Joshua raised his hand. The signal rippled through the ranks. The procession began to move toward Jericho for the 7th time. But this time was different. This time Joshua's voice rang out with a command that every Israelite had been waiting 6 days to hear. Today you shall march around the city 7 times. And when you hear the long blast of the trumpet, when the priests sound the horn, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and every man shall go straight before him. 7 times, 7 circuits on the 7th day, the number of completion, of divine perfection, the number that wove through creation itself, through the very fabric of time as God had established it. 7 days of creation, 7 days of marching. The pattern was unmistakable to those with eyes to see. Inside Jericho, the king had been roused from his sleepless vigil. The report came to him as the first gray light touched the eastern sky. The Israelites were forming up again, but this time the entire nation was assembling. Every person in their camp was moving toward the city. Terror gripped his heart. He climbed to the highest tower of the gate complex, his counselors and generals behind him. From that height, he could see the full magnitude of what approached. The Israelite multitude stretched back toward Gilgal like a human sea. At their head, that terrible golden box carried between priests, and around it a guard of warriors whose discipline and silence were more frightening than any war cry. "Reinforce every gate," he commanded. "Double the men on the walls. If they attack, they will find us ready." But his voice shook as he spoke. They both knew these were empty words. What defense could stand against a people whose God dried up rivers and fed them with bread from heaven? What walls could protect a city that had already been devoted to destruction by forces beyond mortal comprehension? The first circuit began in silence. The only sounds were the measured tread of feet, the occasional clink of armor, the rhythmic blast of the 7 trumpets. On the walls, Jericho's defenders watched with mounting dread. 1 circuit, 2 circuits. The sun climbed higher. 3 circuits. The heat became oppressive. Inside their armor, the Israelite warriors felt sweat running down their backs, but they did not break formation. The priests bearing the ark moved with steady purpose, their steps synchronized, their eyes fixed ahead. 4 circuits, 5 circuits. Rahab stood at her window, watching. Her family huddled behind her, the scarlet cord hanging clearly visible from the frame. With each passing of the ark, she felt something building in the air itself, a pressure, a presence, as if the very atmosphere was being charged with divine energy, accumulating circuit by circuit like water behind a dam. 6 circuits. The trumpets continued their steady blast. Inside Jericho, some of the soldiers began to weep. Others prayed to their gods, offering desperate pleas to Baal, to Asherah, to any power that might deliver them from what was coming. But the idols in their temples remained silent. Carved wood and molded metal offered no comfort, no protection, no hope. The people of Jericho could feel it now. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with a frequency that had nothing to do with marching feet. The stones of the wall themselves seemed to hum with a terrible resonance, as if they were instruments being tuned for destruction. The 7th circuit began. Joshua walked with his eyes on the walls. He had seen fortifications before. Egypt had walls. The cities of Canaan all had walls. But he had also seen what God could do to kingdoms that set themselves against his purposes. He had watched Pharaoh's army swallowed by the sea. He had seen water gush from solid rock. He had witnessed manna appear with the dew. Walls were nothing. Stone was nothing. Before the presence that traveled in the ark ahead of him, All human construction was as fragile as pottery about to be shattered. The final circuit brought them back to their starting point. The entire city had been encompassed 7 times. The number was complete. The moment had arrived. Joshua raised his hand. The procession halted. The trumpets continued their blast, but now their sound changed. The short, rhythmic blasts became one long, sustained note. 7 trumpets, 7 streams of sound merging into a single cry that rose into the morning sky. The priests blew with all their strength. Veins stood out on their necks. Their faces reddened with the effort. The sound was not beautiful. It was raw, primal, a declaration of war from heaven itself. It was the sound of divine judgment taking audible form. Joshua's voice cut through the trumpet blast. "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And the people of Israel shouted. 40,000 warriors raised their voices as one. Behind them, the multitude joined in. Men and women and children released a cry that had been building for 6 days of enforced silence. The sound was tremendous, overwhelming, a human thunder that rolled across the plain and crashed against the walls of Jericho like a breaking wave. But it was more than sound. It was declaration. It was faith made audible. It was the voice of a people who had seen God part waters and rain down bread, who had walked through a river on dry ground, who believed with every fiber of their being that these walls would fall because God had spoken it. The shout continued. It did not diminish, but grew stronger. Throats that should have given out found renewed strength. The cry ascended, layer upon layer of human voices, mixing with the sustained blast of the trumpets, creating a sound that Jericho had never heard, that no city had ever heard. And then the walls began to shake, not from the sound, not from vibration or siege engines or undermining. They shook because the hand of God reached down and touched them. The same power that had spoken worlds into existence, that had carved out ocean basins with a word, that had set stars in their courses, now focused on these walls with concentrated intention. The mortar between the stones began to powder. Microscopic cracks appeared in the mud brick, spreading with impossible speed through the entire structure. The foundations, those massive stones sunk deep into bedrock, shifted. The earth beneath them liquefied for just an instant, releasing its grip. On the walls, the soldiers felt the stone move beneath their feet. They grabbed for support, but there was nothing to hold. The parapet walls crumbled. The walkway tilted. Men scrambled for safety that did not exist. The sound of the collapse drowned out even the shouting. It began with a groan, a deep bass note that came from the walls themselves as the structure gave up its integrity. Then came the crack of breaking stone, sharp reports like lightning strikes, as support beams snapped and keystone arches failed. The outer wall went first. The revetment that had stood at such a proud angle, designed to make scaling impossible, leaned outward. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, defying gravity. Then it toppled, falling away from the city in a cascade of stone and brick and dust. The inner wall followed immediately. Without the support of the outer wall, without the packed earth between them to provide stability, the inner fortifications had nothing to hold them. The massive stones, each weighing more than a team of oxen could pull, tumbled downward. The houses built into the wall structure twisted and collapsed, timber beams snapping like twigs. The dust rose in a great cloud that obscured the sun. It billowed outward from the city in a brown-gray wave, rolling across the plain toward the Israelite army. They stood their ground, still shouting, as the dust cloud engulfed them. They breathed in the destruction of Jericho's defenses, tasted it on their tongues, felt it coat their skin. When the dust began to settle, when the thunder of falling stone faded to the occasional clatter of shifting rubble, when the echoes stopped rolling back from the hills, silence returned to the Jordan Valley. The walls of Jericho lay in ruins. The great fortifications that had stood for centuries, that had defied armies and survived sieges, that had been built and rebuilt and reinforced generation after generation, were gone, flattened. The stones lay scattered outward from the city, creating a ramp of rubble that led directly into the heart of the settlement. Only one section remained standing, a small stretch of the outer wall on the north side, where a house clung to the damaged stone. From its window a scarlet cord hung motionless in the still air. Joshua stood before the ruins, his hand still raised, the trumpet silent behind him. Dust covered his beard, his cloak, his sandals, but his eyes were clear. He had seen the power of God made manifest. He had witnessed the impossible become reality through nothing but obedience and faith. The people of Israel stared at the destruction in awe. Many fell to their knees. Some wept. Others remained standing but bowed their heads in worship. They had believed the promise. They had marched in faith. But to see it fulfilled, to witness these legendary walls reduced to rubble in mere moments, was beyond anything they had imagined. Inside the city, chaos reigned. The collapse had killed hundreds instantly. Soldiers who had been stationed on the walls were buried under tons of stone. Houses throughout the city had been damaged by the earthquake that accompanied the fall. The psychological shock was even more devastating than the physical destruction. In the span of heartbeats, Jericho's impregnable defense had ceased to exist. The king stood on his tower, his face ashen. He had watched the walls fall. He had seen with his own eyes what no report could have prepared him for. His city lay exposed. His people were trapped. The God of Israel had declared war, and no power in heaven or earth could save them. Joshua lowered his hand slowly. The moment of miracle had passed. Now came the moment of judgment. He drew his sword. Behind him, 40,000 warriors did the same. The sound of bronze leaving leather scabbards whispered through the ranks like wind through wheat. His voice carried across the assembled host. "Go up, for the Lord has delivered Jericho into your hand. The city and all that is in it are devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But you, keep yourselves from the devoted things, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. All the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." The command was clear. This was not a conquest for plunder. This was an execution of divine sentence. Jericho had been weighed on heaven's scales and found utterly wanting. The city was Harem, devoted to destruction, marked for total annihilation as an offering to God's justice. The warriors of Israel surged forward. They climbed over the rubble ramps created by the fallen walls, their feet finding purchase on stones that hours before had formed an impenetrable barrier. They poured into the city through gaps that had not existed when the sun rose. The slaughter was terrible and swift. This was not battle, but judgment. The Canaanites of Jericho, who had sacrificed their children to Molech, who had practiced ritual prostitution in their temples, who had filled the land with violence and corruption for generations, now faced the consequences of their choices. The sword moved through the streets like divine wrath made manifest. But even in judgment, there was mercy. 2 men, the spies who had hidden in Rahab's house, pushed through the advancing army toward the north wall. They climbed the rubble pile beneath the section that still stood, calling out as they approached, "Rahab, it is Joshua's men. Come down." She appeared at the window, her face pale but composed. Behind her, her family clustered, their eyes wide with terror at the sounds echoing through the city. "Come down quickly," the spies urged. "Bring everyone who is with you." Rahab and her household descended, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, their spouses and children. The scarlet cord remained tied in the window as proof of covenant, of promise made and kept. The spies escorted them through streets running with blood, past scenes of destruction, out through the ruins and away from the city. They were brought to a place outside the Israelite camp, a location set apart for purification. They had lived among the devoted things. They had breathed Jericho's air, eaten Jericho's food, participated in Jericho's culture. Before they could join Israel, they needed to be cleansed, separated from the defilement that had marked their former home. But they were alive. Alone among all Jericho's inhabitants, Rahab's household survived because she had chosen faith over fear, because she had recognized the hand of God in history and aligned herself with His purposes. Inside the city, the destruction continued. Everything living was put to the sword. Men and women, young and old. Even the livestock were killed, the sheep and oxen and donkeys that filled the pens and stables. This was the ban, the harem, applied in its fullness. Nothing that breathed was to survive. The warriors moved through houses, searching every room. They found people hiding in cellars and storage rooms, cowering in temples before their useless gods. They found the wealthy in their fine homes, surrounded by treasures that could not save them. They found the poor in their hovels, no less guilty than the rich of the sins that had condemned their city. All the silver and gold was gathered, vessels of bronze and iron, tools and weapons and ornaments, everything of value that could not burn. These were set aside for the Lord's treasury, sacred plunder that would support the tabernacle worship, that would be used in the service of the true God rather than the false deities of Canaan. Then came the fire. Torches were thrown into houses. The dry timber caught immediately. Flames spread from building to building, from street to street. The fire consumed everything the sword had not destroyed. Wood and fabric and stored grain, the accumulated possessions of generations, all turned to smoke and ash. The temples of Baal burned. The high places where children had been sacrificed went up in flames. The brothel shrines of Asherah became infernos. Every structure dedicated to false worship, every building where abomination had been practiced, was cleansed by fire. Jericho had been a wealthy city. Centuries of control over the Jordan crossings had filled its storehouses with goods from a dozen nations, pottery from Egypt, textiles from Damascus, spices from the southern trade routes, grain and wine and oil in massive quantities. All of it burned. The smoke rose into the sky in a pillar that could be seen for miles, a signal to every city in Canaan that the God of Israel had begun to reclaim the land. Joshua stood at a distance, watching the flames consume what the earthquake had exposed. His face was grim. There was no joy in this destruction, no pleasure in the death that had been necessary. But there was satisfaction in obedience, in seeing God's justice executed, in knowing that a foothold had been established in the land of promise. The fire burned through the day and into the night. The glow could be seen from the hills of Ephraim to the north, and from the mountains of Moab to the east. Every eye in Canaan turned toward that pillar of smoke and understood what it meant. The Israelites were not raiders. They were not looking for plunder or temporary conquest. They were executing a divine mandate. They were reclaiming an inheritance by the authority of heaven itself. And no wall, no matter how thick, no army, no matter how skilled, would stand before them when God fought on their side. As the flames consumed the last standing structures, Joshua called the people together. They assembled in the area where they had marched, where they had circled the city 7 times, where they had shouted at his command and seen walls fall at God's word. He raised his voice so all could hear. Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. The curse fell over the ruins like a shroud. This place would not rise again easily. Anyone who attempted to restore what God had destroyed would pay a terrible price. The stones themselves bore witness to divine judgment. They would remain a memorial, a warning, a testimony to what happens when cities set themselves against the purposes of heaven. But something else happened in those flames and ruins, something that would echo through the centuries in ways Joshua could not fully comprehend as he stood watching the fire. The fall of Jericho shattered an understanding that had governed the ancient world since cities first raised walls around themselves. The dust still hung in the air like a burial shroud over what had been the most impenetrable fortress in Canaan. Through the haze of pulverized limestone and shattered clay, the reality became visible to eyes that had witnessed the impossible. Jericho was not merely conquered. Jericho was annihilated. The warriors of Israel moved through the fallen walls with weapons drawn, but faces marked by something beyond battle fury. This was not the expression of men who had climbed ladders, or battered gates, or paid for victory with blood. This was the countenance of witnesses. They walked through rubble that should have taken months to create, past stones that no siege engine had touched, over foundations that divine power alone had torn from the earth. Joshua stood at what had been the main gate, now nothing but scattered rock and broken timber. His hand still gripped the ram's horn, though the sound had long faded. Around him, his commanders waited for orders, but the leader of Israel remained silent, his eyes fixed on the destruction that faith had wrought. He was calculating something beyond military strategy. He was understanding that the army of Israel had just been shown the true nature of the war they were fighting. The victory at Jericho was absolute. Joshua's command had been clear and brutal. Everything that breathed was to be devoted to destruction. This was not conquest for plunder. This was judgment executed through human hands, but ordered by divine justice. The city that had stood as a monument to Canaanite power would become a testimony to something older and more terrible than any earthly kingdom. The soldiers moved through the burning streets methodically, fulfilling the command without hesitation. Livestock, inhabitants, the young and old, all fell to Israelite swords. The brutality was deliberate. The completeness was intentional. This was not merely military necessity. This was the cleansing of a land that had been corrupted beyond redemption, where children had been burned alive in offerings to Molech, where temple prostitution had become worship, where abominations had been normalized across generations. Only one structure was spared the total destruction. High in what remained of the outer wall, a window hung with scarlet cord caught the eye of Joshua's scouts. They climbed through rubble and devastation to reach the house of Rahab the harlot, finding her and her family huddled together, alive while the city died around them. The scarlet cord had held its promise. The woman who had hidden the spies, who had confessed faith in the God of Israel while her own people prepared for war, now stood protected by the very oath she had secured. Her household was brought out carefully, ceremonially, placed outside the camp of Israel while the purification rituals were prepared. She had betrayed her city and saved her soul. She had chosen the covenant over her people and found herself adopted into a nation she had never known. Rahab's survival would echo through centuries. This Canaanite woman, this prostitute from a condemned city, would marry into Israel. Her name would appear in genealogies that led to kings. Matthew's gospel would list her as an ancestor of Jesus himself. The woman who had hung red cord from her window would become part of the bloodline of redemption, proof that the covenant always made room for faith, regardless of origin or past. But as Rahab and her family were led to safety, Joshua gathered the elders and priests for what came next. The silver and gold, the bronze and iron implements, all the wealth of Jericho, was collected not for personal enrichment, but for the treasury of the tabernacle. This victory belonged to God alone. The spoils were consecrated, set apart, devoted to the service of the covenant, just as the city itself had been devoted to destruction. Then Joshua pronounced a curse that would resonate across centuries. Standing in the ruins with his army gathered around him, he spoke with the authority of a prophet and the weight of divine backing. Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and rebuilds this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. The words were not merely a prohibition, they were a prophecy. This place where God had manifested his power so dramatically would remain a memorial to his judgment. Anyone who attempted to restore what the Lord had torn down would pay with the highest price imaginable. The curse was recorded, remembered, passed down through generations as a warning about the folly of rebuilding what God had destroyed. The fall of Jericho sent shockwaves through Canaan that no military conquest could have achieved. News traveled faster than armies could march. City-states that had watched Jericho's defenses with confidence now understood that conventional warfare meant nothing against these invaders. The Israelites did not fight according to normal patterns. They did not rely on superior weapons or tactics. They served a power that could unmake creation itself. Kings gathered in emergency councils. Alliances that had seemed unnecessary suddenly became desperate. The Canaanite rulers understood something that modern skeptics often miss. The fall of Jericho was not a natural disaster explained away by earthquakes or timing. It was a declaration that the God of Abraham had returned to claim the land his covenant had promised. But the victory at Jericho created a dangerous moment for Israel. Success has a way of breeding confidence that slides into presumption. The next target was Ai, a smaller city that seemed insignificant compared to the fortress they had just destroyed. Joshua sent spies who returned with dismissive reports. 2,000 or 3,000 men would be sufficient. Why send the whole army against such a minor obstacle? Israel attacked Ai with overconfidence and was driven back in humiliating defeat. 36 men died. The army that had watched walls collapse through faith now fled before ordinary soldiers defending an ordinary town. Joshua tore his clothes and fell on his face before the Ark of the Covenant, demanding to know how victory had turned to defeat so swiftly. The answer came through divine revelation. Someone had taken devoted things from Jericho. Someone had violated the command to consecrate all plunder to God. Hidden somewhere in the camp of Israel was stolen silver, a beautiful Babylonian garment, gold that belonged in the tabernacle treasury. The sin of one man had contaminated the entire nation, severing the divine backing that had made them invincible. The exposure of Achan and his theft, the discovery of treasures buried beneath his tent, the subsequent execution of him and his household, all of this flowed directly from the victory at Jericho. The lesson was brutal and clear. The power that had destroyed Jericho's walls was not a weapon Israel controlled. It was a covenant relationship that demanded absolute obedience. Presumption would be punished as severely as rebellion. After the sin was purged, Ai fell easily. The conquest of Canaan continued with Joshua leading the campaigns, but Jericho remained the psychological turning point. Every subsequent battle was measured against the impossibility of those collapsed walls. Every victory was understood in light of what faith and obedience could accomplish when aligned with divine purpose. The ruins of Jericho lay abandoned for centuries, a heap of stones slowly being reclaimed by dust and vegetation. The curse held. No one dared rebuild what God had torn down. The site became a landmark, a geographical sermon about the consequences of standing against the covenant people. But curses, like prophecies, eventually find their fulfillment. During the reign of Ahab, one of Israel's most wicked kings, a man named Heel of Bethel, decided to rebuild Jericho. Perhaps he thought the curse was metaphorical. Perhaps he believed enough time had passed to make it irrelevant. Perhaps he simply did not believe. As Hiel laid the foundations of the new city, his firstborn son died. The coincidence might have given him pause, but he continued the work. When he set up the gates of the rebuilt Jericho, his youngest son died. The curse spoken by Joshua more than 500 years earlier had proven itself word for word. The price of rebuilding what God had destroyed was paid in the lives of children, exactly as pronounced. The historical legacy of Jericho's fall extended beyond Israel's borders. Ancient records from surrounding civilizations show evidence of the chaos that swept through Canaan during the period of conquest. Egyptian correspondence, particularly the Amarna letters, contains desperate pleas from Canaanite rulers describing invaders called the Habiru, who were destabilizing the entire region. While scholars debate precise connections, the timeline and descriptions align with the biblical account of Joshua's campaigns. Archaeological excavations at Tel es-Sultan, the site identified as ancient Jericho, have yielded evidence that has fueled debates for over a century. Early excavations by Kathleen Kenyon suggested the city had been destroyed long before the biblical time frame. But more recent work has challenged her dating methods, with some archaeologists now arguing for evidence of destruction consistent with the late Bronze Age period when Joshua would have lived. The debate over Jericho's archaeological record often misses a crucial point. The biblical account describes walls collapsing outward and then being burned. It describes a city so thoroughly destroyed that it became a permanent ruin. Such complete devastation, followed by centuries of abandonment, would leave ambiguous remains at best. The absence of clear, conventional conquest evidence might actually support the biblical narrative rather than contradict it. But the true legacy of Jericho's fall has never been primarily archaeological or historical. It has been theological and spiritual. For 3,000 years, the story of those collapsed walls has served as the defining illustration of what faith can accomplish when aligned with divine purpose. The New Testament writers understood this. The book of Hebrews includes Jericho in its great catalog of faith. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. The impossible victory was held up as proof that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The story became teaching. The historical event became spiritual principle. Joshua himself stands as one of the most remarkable figures in biblical history. He had been Moses' assistant through the wilderness years, witnessing the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the giving of the law at Sinai. He had seen miracles that convinced an entire generation. But at Jericho, he became the leader through whom God chose to demonstrate that the new generation would witness wonders as great as those their parents had seen. The miracle at Jericho vindicated Joshua's leadership in a way that no military victory could have achieved. From that moment forward, his authority was unquestionable. The text records that his fame spread through all the land. He was not famous as a brilliant general or charismatic leader, but as a man through whom God worked in visible, undeniable ways. The pattern established at Jericho, complete obedience, producing supernatural results, became the template for Joshua's entire campaign. When the sun needed to stand still to complete a victory at Gibeon, Joshua commanded it with the same confidence he had commanded the people to march around Jericho. The habit of expecting God to intervene in impossible situations had been formed by those 7 days of silent circling and patient trust. For the people of Israel, Jericho became their defining proof that the covenant was still active, that the promises made to Abraham had lost none of their power across the centuries. Their parents had died in the wilderness because of unbelief. But this generation had seen with their own eyes that obedience produced miracles. The memory of those falling walls would be passed to children and grandchildren as evidence that the God they served was not distant or abstract, but actively involved in their national life. The spiritual implications of Jericho have been explored by theologians and preachers across every generation since. The walls have been interpreted as representing obstacles that seem immovable, circumstances that reason says cannot be overcome, situations where human strength is clearly insufficient. The march around the walls has been seen as representing faithful obedience even when it makes no logical sense, persistence when there is no visible evidence of progress. The silence commanded during the marching has been interpreted as the discipline of not speaking doubt or defeat, of holding the tongue until the moment of declaration arrives. The number 7 has been noted as the biblical number of completion and perfection, suggesting that timing matters in divine operations. The shout that preceded the collapse has been seen as the voice of faith, making declarations that seem premature to natural observation, but which align with spiritual reality. These interpretations, while allegorical, are not entirely disconnected from the historical reality. The actual event at Jericho demonstrated principles that transcend the specific situation. Faith that produces patience. Obedience that looks foolish until it proves wise. Silence that protects focus. Corporate unity that multiplies power. Sudden breakthrough after prolonged waiting. These patterns appear throughout Scripture and throughout the experience of those who attempt to live by covenant faith. But Jericho also established a darker precedent that cannot be ignored. The complete destruction commanded there, the devotion of everything to the ban of destruction, raises questions that have troubled readers across the centuries. How could a just God command the killing of entire populations? How does this square with the ethics taught later by the prophets and by Jesus himself? The answer requires understanding the unique historical and spiritual moment of the conquest. Canaan had become so corrupt that even the land itself was described as defiled, ready to vomit out its inhabitants. Archaeological evidence confirms the biblical descriptions of Canaanite religious practices involving child sacrifice, cult prostitution, and systematic abuse. The judgment executed through Israel was not arbitrary cruelty, but the removal of a civilizational cancer before it could spread. Moreover, the conquest was never meant to be the permanent pattern for how God's people interact with the world. It was a specific judgment in a specific place at a specific time. The prophets would later condemn Israel when they adopted the violent patterns of surrounding nations. Jesus would command love for enemies and prayer for persecutors. The arc of biblical revelation moves toward redemption rather than destruction, though judgment remains a reality for unrepentant evil. Jericho stands at a particular moment in that arc, the establishment of Israel in the land promised to Abraham, the removal of peoples who had filled up their measure of sin, the demonstration that the covenant God was not a local deity to be negotiated with, but the sovereign Creator, executing his purposes through his chosen people. The prostitute Rahab's inclusion in this story prevents any simplistic reading of the conquest as mere ethnic cleansing. Her survival proved that the issue was never bloodline, but faith. Any Canaanite who turned to Israel's God could be saved. The judgment fell not on a race, but on a spiritual rebellion that had manifested in abominable practices. Rahab chose faith and was adopted. Jericho's other inhabitants chose resistance and were destroyed. The centuries that followed saw Jericho's ruins become a teaching site. Parents would take their children to the heap of stones and tell the story of what faith and obedience had accomplished. The site became a memorial, a physical reminder that with God nothing is impossible. The rubble preached sermons that no eloquence could match. During the divided kingdom period, when Israel and Judah had split into competing nations, the ruins of Jericho still stood as testimony. When prophets called the people back to covenant faithfulness, they could point to Jericho and remind them what power was available to those who obeyed completely. When kings contemplated alliances with foreign powers rather than trusting God, the stones of Jericho stood as witnesses against such pragmatic faithlessness. Even during the exile, when Jerusalem itself lay in ruins and the people were scattered to Babylon, the story of Jericho retained its power. If God could bring down impregnable walls for Joshua, he could restore his people from impossible captivity. The miracle at Jericho became a seed of hope for return and restoration. When the exiles did return under Ezra and Nehemiah, they faced the task of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls while surrounded by hostile neighbors. The memory of Jericho worked in reverse. Just as God had torn down walls for his purposes, he could raise them up. The reconstruction of Jerusalem succeeded because the people believed that the same power that had operated at Jericho was still available to covenant faith. By the time of Jesus, Jericho had long been rebuilt despite the ancient curse. The city existed as a winter resort for Herod and a prosperous trading center, but the old ruins still existed nearby, and the story was still told. When Jesus visited Jericho and healed blind Bartimaeus, when he called Zacchaeus down from the sycamore tree, he was walking through a city whose name resonated with implications of impossible obstacles overcome by faith. The walls of Jericho had become metaphor, but the metaphor was grounded in verified history. Jesus and his disciples knew they walked in a place where the impossible had occurred. The miracles Jesus performed there carried echoes of the greater miracle that had once destroyed the city. The early church understood Jericho's significance. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, facing its own impregnable walls of pagan culture and imperial opposition, the story of Jericho reminded believers that visible strength meant nothing against spiritual power. The empire that seemed unconquerable would eventually fall to faith that seemed weak. The pattern established at Jericho, patient obedience producing sudden transformation, would repeat on a civilizational scale. Across the centuries, in moments when the faithful faced impossible circumstances, the walls of Jericho have been remembered and invoked. During the Protestant Reformation, when reformers challenged the institutional power of the medieval church, they drew courage from Jericho. During the modern civil rights movement, when segregation seemed as immovable as ancient stones, marchers sang of Jericho's walls tumbling down. In personal struggles with addiction, poverty, injustice, and despair, countless individuals have held to the promise that walls can fall when faith persists. The legacy of Jericho is not primarily about military conquest or ancient warfare. It is about the nature of faith itself, its patience, its persistence, its power when aligned with divine purpose. The story declares that what seems impossible to human effort becomes possible when divine power is properly engaged through obedience and trust. Jericho stands as evidence that the universe is not a closed system of natural laws indifferent to human need. It is governed by a person who responds to faith, who honors covenants, who intervenes in history. The collapsed walls are testimony that spiritual reality is more fundamental than physical reality, that what God speaks carries more weight than what human hands build. The site itself, now located in the West Bank near the Palestinian city of Jericho, still draws visitors from around the world. Archaeologists still debate what the ruins reveal. Believers still come seeking connection to the story that has shaped their faith. The ancient tale rises from the Jordan Valley, layers of civilization built and destroyed, rebuilt and destroyed again, a testament to the impermanence of human structures. But the story outlasts the stones. The narrative of what happened at Jericho 3,000 years ago continues to be told, taught, preached, and applied. It appears in children's books and doctoral dissertations, in Sunday school lessons and scholarly journals. The falling walls have become part of human consciousness beyond religious boundaries, an image of sudden breakthrough after prolonged preparation. The lesson of Jericho is not that faith makes life easy or that obedience guarantees immediate success. Joshua's people marched 6 days with no visible result. They looked foolish to any observer who did not know the end of the story. Faith often requires persistent obedience through periods when nothing seems to be happening, when the walls remain standing, when circumstances appear unchanged. But Jericho teaches that such seasons of seemingly fruitless obedience are not wasted. Something is happening beneath the surface. Spiritual reality is shifting even when physical reality appears static. And there comes a moment, sometimes suddenly, sometimes after long waiting, when what seemed impossible simply collapses before faith that has remained steadfast. The ram's horn that Joshua blew at Jericho echoes still. It sounds in every situation where people choose to trust rather than doubt, to obey rather than rely on human wisdom, to persist rather than give up. The sound carries across centuries, a note of defiance against despair, a declaration that walls are not permanent and obstacles are not ultimate. The dust has long settled over Jericho's ruins. The stones lie where they fell, mixed now with the debris of later cities and later judgments. But the truth those stones proclaim remains. The covenant God keeps his promises. Faith that seems foolish often proves wiser than pragmatism. Obedience that looks weak can channel power that shatters the strongest defenses. Walls that appear impregnable can fall in moments when divine timing arrives. This is the legacy of Jericho, not merely that walls fell, but that they fell to faith. Not merely that a city was conquered, but that it was conquered by methods that defied all military logic. Not merely that Israel gained a foothold in Canaan, but that they learned the pattern that would define their entire national existence. Trust God completely, obey his commands precisely, and watch impossibilities become testimonies. The walls that fell overnight stand as eternal witness to the nature of covenant faith. They declare that with God nothing is impossible. They testify that patience produces breakthrough. They prove that what seems foolish to human wisdom can be the very method by which divine power manifests. And they promise that every generation facing its own Jericho can draw courage from stones that fell 3 millennia ago when faith and obedience aligned with divine purpose, and the impossible became history.